close your eyes for a moment and imagine the slow roll of waves against a rocky shore, the scent of olive trees caught in the wind, and the echo of something ancient awakening beneath the sunlit sky. This is where it began, Greece, a land that would shape the human story more than any other. But before there were temples or philosophers, there were whispers, legends of gods walking among mortals, of chaos giving birth to order, of a people learning to listen to the world around them. The mountains cut Greece into countless valleys, and the sea wrapped its arms around them like a patient teacher. Here, isolation bred difference, each city its own world, each shore its own soul. From the Cyclades to the Peloponnese, small communities learned to work with the stone and the sea, creating vessels that could ride the Aegean winds and stories that could outlast time. Archaeologists still find traces of their beginnings, pottery etched with spirals and waves, bones of animals offered to unseen gods, walls built not by kings but by entire villages bound by purpose. It's believed that long before the word Greek even existed, there was the Minoan world on Crete, place of labyrinthine palaces, mysterious scripts and frescoes that told stories without words. Some say this was Europe's first true civilization, a people devoted to beauty and ritual. Others argue it was only a dream that drowned when nature turned cruel, because one day fire and sea conspired, and the island of Thera erupted, blotting out the sun and scattering ash as far as Egypt. From this silence rose the Mycenaeans, the warriors of bronze and shadow, remembered for their walls and their graves, for kings whose names live only in Mythagamemnon, Perseus, Helen. They spoke a language closer to our own, yet still strange. Their world a blend of trade and war, splendor and fear. They built their citadels high, as if to defy the gods, and buried their dead with gold masts' faces, forever frozen in a kind of divine exhaustion. This was Greece before Greece, the heartbeats before the thought, a civilization learning to dream. And somewhere between stone and sea, a question began to form. What does it mean to be human? The answer would echo for centuries, reshaping everything that came after. When the Mycenaeans rose from the ashes of the Minoans, the world took on a sharper edge. Bronze glinted in the sunlight like a warning, and the air was thick with tales of heroes and monsters. It was an age when myth and memory bled together, when history wore the mask of legend. From this time came the stories that still haunt our imaginations, the wrath of Achilles, the cunning of Odysseus, the sorrow of Troy. Scholars say the Trojan War may have been real, fought not for love but for control of trade routes, for the wealth of the East that poured through the dark. Yet, in the Greek mind, war was never just politics, it was destiny, a clash of mortal pride and divine will. The poets would later sing of gods who guided arrows and storms, of men who fought knowing their fates were sealed. And in those songs, Greece found its soul. The ruins of Mycenae and Tiryns still whisper of this iramassive stones set in place by forgotten hands, cyclopean walls that seem to defy time itself. Within their shadows lie the Tholos tombs, round chambers echoing with the stillness of centuries, built to hold kings who believed they were close to the divine. But all empires burn eventually, and the Mycenaean world fell not with a bang, but with silence. Around 1200 BCE, fire consumed their palaces, trade collapsed, and the art of writing was forgotten. For centuries afterward, Greece entered what we now call its dark age, a time when memory became myth, and myth became the only truth left. Villages shrank, kings vanished, and the old gods went quiet. Yet even in the quiet, the Greek spirit endured. Families gathered around flickering hearths to tell stories of what once was of bravery, loss, and the uncertain favor of the gods. These stories became the threads that would later be woven into Homer's epics. And while the world seemed to sleep, something new was forming beneath the ashes, a hunger for knowledge, for beauty, for meaning beyond mere survival. The age of heroes had ended, but its ghosts would guide the Greeks through the centuries to come. The question was not whether they would rise again, it was when Greece finally stirred from its centuries of darkness. It did not awaken as a single kingdom, but as a mosaic of fierce and independent city-states. This was the birth of the polis, a word that meant more than a city. It was a way of life, a shared soul bound by stone, faith, and memory. Around every hilltop, new settlements emerged, their people carving homes from the ruins of what their ancestors had lost. The Greeks learned again to write, borrowing symbols from the Phoenicians and shaping them into their own alphabet, the same letters that would one day form the words of philosophers and poets. Iron replaced bronze, not as a symbol of decay, but of resilience. With it came a new kind of warfare and a new kind of unity, the phalanx, where men stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping like scales of a living creature. No longer did heroes fight alone for glory. Now, citizens fought together for the survival of their polis. Each city grew its own rhythms, Sparta with its discipline, Athens with its curiosity, Corinth with its trade, Thebes with its ambition, and between them stretched the blue veins of the Aegean Sea, connecting them as much as it divided them. The Greeks learned to sail farther, to trade their olive oil and pottery for the grain and metals their rocky soil could not give. Colonies sprang up along the coastlines of Italy, Asia Minor, and beyond, each carrying with them a fragment of the Greek spirit. This was not empire, it was expansion by imagination. Yet beneath this rise lingered unease. The Greeks began to ask questions their ancestors never dared. Who rules the ruler? What is justice? What binds men together when the gods fall silent? These were not the questions of survival, but of awakening. In the agora, the heart of every city's citizens gathered to debate, to trade, to argue, to dream. The polis became both cradle and crucible, shaping every Greek into something newer, being aware of his own voice in the world. The Dark Age was over, but light can reveal as much danger as it dispels. For within every polis, pride grew, and where pride grows, conflict is never far behind. The seeds of greatness and ruin were already sown, as the centuries turned and the city-states grew restless beneath their sunlit skies. The Greeks looked outward to the horizon. Their homeland was beautiful, but unforgiving. Its rocky soil yielded little, its valleys too narrow for ambition. So they built ships, sleek and proud, and followed the sea as if answering an ancient calling. The Aegean became their mirror, and beyond it lay possibility. From the coastlines of Asia Minor to the distant shores of Italy and Sicily, the Greeks began to settle new lands. These were not colonies in the modern sense, but extensions of the solid new city carrying the customs, gods, and dialects of its mother polis. Miletus, Corinth, and Chalcis sent out fleets of settlers, driven by hunger, trade, and curiosity. They founded Massalia, modern-day Marseille, on the edge of the known world, and Naucratis in Egypt, where the desert met the Nile. Wherever they landed, they left behind their mark, temples of white stone, amphorae patterned with stories, and marketplaces that hummed with the sound of many tongues. The Greeks traded olive oil for Egyptian grain, wine for Persian silver, art for ideas. This exchange was not only of goods, but of thought. From the East they learned mathematics and astronomy. From the West they carried myths and philosophy. In this great web of movement, the Greek identity expanded yet never dissolved. Each city remained fiercely loyal to its origins, but together they formed a network that bound the Mediterranean world. Some scholars call this the true beginning of globalization, civilization that lived on the water, sustained by motion, communication, and risk. Yet, with every voyage came danger. Pirates haunted the straits, storms rose without warning, and foreign kings were not always kind to Greek ambition. But still they sailed, guided by stars and instinct, for the sea was their teacher. The poet Hesiod once wrote that a man without risk is a man without destiny, and nowhere was that truer than in this age of Greek expansion. The colonies became bridges between past and future, between myth and reason. But in uniting the world through trade, the Greeks also began to unite it through rivalry. New wealth meant new power, and new power would demand new forms of rule. As the ships returned home laden with riches, the question waiting on every shore was the same: who should command this rising tide? As the colonies flourished and trade filled the harbors with wealth, the heart of Greece began to change. The small farmers and craftsmen who had once stood as equals in the phalanx found themselves overshadowed by merchants, nobles, and those who profited most from the expanding world. Inequality deepened, and with it, tension grew in the narrow streets of the polis. The people began to murmur against their rulers, and in this space between order and chaos, a new figure emerged: the tyrant. To the Greeks, the word did not yet mean cruelty. It meant opportunity, the one who seized power when the system failed. In cities like Corinth, Megara, and Athens, these men rose by promising justice to the poor and stability to the restless. They built roads, temples, and marketplaces, giving the people reason to hope even as they tightened their own grip on power. Cypselus of Corinth brought prosperity through trade. Pisistratus of Athens, though a usurper, adorned the city with art and gave farmers land to till. For a time, tyranny seemed to work, a strange blend of ambition and benevolence. But power, once seized, rarely releases its hold gently. Over generations, tyranny curdled into oppression, and the people learned that no ruler, no matter how generous, could hold absolute power without corruption. From this disillusionment, a new hunger grew, not for a savior, but for a system. In Sparta, that system was order carved in iron. Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver, reshaped the city into a living machine of discipline, where every man served the state and every woman bore sons for war. Gold was banned, luxury despised, and freedom defined by obedience. To outsiders it seemed harsh, but to the Spartans it was perfection, a society without excess, without weakness. Meanwhile, in Athens, a different path was forming. Solon, the reformer, rose to balance chaos with wisdom. He forgave debts, freed the enslaved, and rewrote the laws to give voice to those long silenced. He did not end conflict, but he changed its shape. The Greeks were beginning to learn that true power might not lie in kings or tyrants, but in the people themselves. Yet freedom, once glimpsed, can never be forgotten, and its pursuit would drive Greece into its greatest triumphs and its darkest wars, as Greece found its rhythm between freedom and order. Another power stirred far to the east, vast empires stretching from the Indus to the Aegean. ruled by kings who believed themselves chosen by the heavens. The Persians watched the restless Greek world with both fascination and unease. To them, the city-states were like sparks, brilliant but dangerous, too unpredictable to be ignored. The tension began when Greek colonies in Asia Minor rebelled against Persian control, and in their desperation, they called to their kin across the sea for help. Athens, still young in its democracy, answered. It seemed a small act, almost noble, but history rarely forgives small acts of defiance. Darius, the great king of Persia, saw it not as rebellion but insult, and from that moment his gaze fixed upon Greece. The first invasion came like a storm. Persian ships darkened the horizon, their numbers beyond counting, their soldiers drawn from every corner of the empire, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, all marching under one banner. The Greeks, divided as always, stood trembling between pride and fear. Yet at Marathon, a small Athenian force met the might of Persia head-on, and did the impossible. They won. The victory echoed across the world, carried by messengers who ran until their hearts gave out. But even as Athens celebrated, Darius's son, Xerxes, prepared a vengeance more terrible than his father's. A bridge of boats was built across the Hellespont, and the largest army the world had ever seen marched toward Greece. This time, the Greeks knew they would have to stand together or fall alone. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans held the pass against an ocean of men, their courage buying time for the cities to unite. They died where they stood, but their stand became legend, the kind that burns brighter than victory itself. Soon after, at Salamis, Athenian ships trapped the Persian fleet in narrow waters and turned the tide. By the time the dust settled, the invincible empire had been humbled, and Greece stood free once more. But freedom won through unity rarely lasts long. As the Persian shadow faded, a new one began to form, not from without, but from within. For the Greeks, victory was only the beginning of their greatest test, the struggle against themselves, with Persia defeated and the echoes of war still drifting through the Aegean. Athens rose like a phoenix from the ashes of fear. The city that had once been a cluster of villages now began to see itself as the heart of something larger, force of destiny. Its ships, once built for survival, now sailed as instruments of empire. The Delian League was born, a union of Greek states sworn to defend against Persia. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, it became an Athenian empire in disguise. Tribute flowed into the city from distant islands and coasts, and with it came marble, art, and ambition. Under the leadership of Pericles, Athens transformed from a fortress into a masterpiece. The Parthenon rose on the Acropolis like a hymn to the gods, its columns shimmering in the sun, its friezes telling stories of both mortals and immortals. Sculptors captured the divine in human form. Playwrights gave voice to tragedy and laughter. Philosophers began to ask questions that even the gods could not answer. The agora thrived, a living pulse of commerce and debate. Here, ideas clashed like warriors, and democracy found its shape not in perfection but in argument. Every citizen had a voice, yet not all were heard. Slaves, women, and foreigners still stood outside the circle of equality. But within that imperfection lay something revolutionary, the belief that reason, not birth, could guide the fate of men. Athens became more than a city. It was a vision of what humanity might be when freed from fear. Yet even as its walls gleamed with beauty, cracks began to form. The wealth that sustained its splendor came from allies who no longer gave willingly, and the pride that had once united Greece now fed resentment. Sparta watched from the south, wary of Athens's growing reach. Two visions of Greece had emerged, one built on freedom and intellect, the other on discipline and order. It was only a matter of time before they collided. But for now, under the blue skies of the 5th century, Athens stood at its zenith, a city of stone and thought, of empire and art, believing itself eternal. No one could yet imagine how swiftly greatness could turn to ruin. The rivalry between Athens and Sparta simmered for decades, like a storm gathering behind the mountains. Both believed themselves protectors of Greece, yet both desired to shape its destiny in their own image. Sparta stood for order, strength, and endurance. Athens for freedom, intellect, and ambition. Their alliance, forged in the fires of Persian invasion, crumbled beneath the weight of pride. By 431 BCE, the fragile peace dissolved, and the Peloponnesian War began, a conflict not of nations, but of ideals. The first clashes came swiftly, brutal and uncertain. Spartan armies marched into Attica, burning the fields that fed Athens, while Athenian ships raided the Peloponnesian coasts in vengeance. The sea and land became mirrors of chaos. Pericles urged his people to endure behind the long walls, to trust in their navy and patience. But within those walls, plague came instead. It swept through the crowded city like a curse, striking rich and poor alike, taking even Pericles himself. The brilliance of Athens dimmed, replaced by desperation and suspicion. Yet still, the war dragged on, reshaping the Greek world year after year. Battles flared at Amphipolis, Pylos, and Mantinea, each one a story of valor and futility. The Athenian democracy turned inward, devouring itself with blame and fear. Then came the Sicilian expeditioner, gamble born of arrogance. Alcibiades, the charming and reckless general, convinced Athens to send a vast fleet across the sea to conquer Syracuse. It was meant to be a new triumph, but it became a grave. The fleet was annihilated, its men enslaved or slain, its hope extinguished in foreign dust. When word reached Athens, the city wailed as if struck by lightning. Sparta, with Persian gold now flowing into its coffers, pressed harder than ever, cutting off Athens's lifelines. By 404 BCE, after nearly 30 years of blood and ruin, Athens surrendered. Its walls were torn down, its empire dismantled, its people left in stunned silence. Sparta stood victorious, but not unscarred. The war had consumed the very soul of Greece, leaving behind a hollow triumph. The unity that had once defeated empires was gone, replaced by exhaustion and distrust. And in that silence, as the smoke cleared over a broken land, a new power began to stir in the north, watching, waiting, preparing to claim what the Greeks had forgotten how to protect. In the shadow of a fractured Greece, far to the north beyond the old mountain passes, a kingdom once dismissed as barbaric began to rise. Macedon, rough and untamed, had watched the endless wars of the city-states with patient eyes. Its people were Greek in tongue but foreign in manner, a blend of highland warriors and cunning nobles who hunted more than they traded, who spoke less of philosophy and more of conquest. It was here that a man named Philip II ascended to the throne, and with him came a vision that would change the world. When Philip took power, Macedon was little more than a scattered realm of rival clans. But he saw in its soil the seeds of empire. He trained its soldiers into a new kind of army, disciplined, relentless, and unified. The phalanx was reborn under his hand. no longer a citizen militia, but a professional force armed with sarissas, long spears that could pierce through chaos itself. He forged alliances through marriage and destroyed enemies through strategy, using gold as deftly as the sword. While Athens debated and Sparta remembered its glory, Philip moved. One by one, the Greek cities fell under his influence, some by diplomacy, others by war. The Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE ended all illusion of Greek independence. There, the old and proud armies of Athens and Thebes were crushed by the precision of Macedon's steel. And among Philip's soldiers stood a young prince named Alexander, barely 18, who commanded the cavalry that broke Thebes. With Greece subdued, Philip planned to turn his gaze east toward Persia, to avenge the wars of the past and seize their wealth for his new empire. Yet fate is cruel to those who plan too far ahead. In the midst of his triumph, during a festival in Aegae, Philip was struck down by an assassin's blade. The world that he had unified trembled on the edge of collapse. But in the silence that followed, a new voice would rise, a son born of fire and ambition, destined to outshine even the gods his people worshipped. The Greeks had long sought meaning in their wars. Soon they would find it in a single man whose shadow would fall across the entire world. When Philip's blood stained the marble of Aegae, Greece held its breath. Assassins had ended a king, but they had unleashed something far greater. His son, Alexander, was only 20, but even then, those who met his gaze felt the pull of something otherworldly. Taught by Aristotle, heir to a warrior's throne, Alexander carried both wisdom and fire. Where others saw borders, he saw destiny. Yet before he could claim the world, he had to claim Greece. The moment his father's crown touched his head, rebellion flared across the land. Thebes rose first, believing the boy would falter. They were wrong. Alexander descended upon the city like a storm. Within days, Thebes was destroyed, its people sold, its stones scattered, warning to all who would doubt him. The message was clear. Greece would march not against itself, but with him. With his back secured, Alexander turned east, where the Persian Empire still stood vast and proud under Darius III. He crossed the Hellespont with an army of fewer than 50,000, but every man in it believed they were walking with history itself. At Troy, he offered sacrifice to Achilles, his ancestor by myth, as if to bind his name to legend. The first great clash came at the river Granicus, where Persian cavalry thundered down the banks, and Alexander, against all counsel, led the charge himself. His horse, Bucephalus, carried him straight through the chaos, his spear striking like lightning. Victory came swift and brutal, and Asia lay open before him. City after city fell: Sardis, Halicarnassus, and then the jewel of the empire, Issus, where Darius fled and left his family behind. Alexander treated them with honor, a conqueror who played the part of a god. His legend spread faster than his army stories of his courage, his mercy, his fury. He was no longer just a Macedonian king. He was something more, something larger than life. In Egypt, he was welcomed as a liberator and crowned as a pharaoh. There he founded Alexandria, a city meant to outlast time itself. But even as he built, he was still chasing something unseen, a vision that reached beyond the known world, driven by a need not just to conquer, but to understand what lay beyond the edge of human ambition. When Alexander left Egypt and turned his army east, the earth itself seemed to bow beneath his ambition. His men had already crossed deserts and rivers that most Greeks had only heard of in stories. Yet ahead lay the heart of the Persian Empire, endless, and guarded by armies larger than anything the world had seen. At Gaugamela, near the plains of modern Iraq, Darius III assembled a force said to number in the hundreds of thousands. The air shimmered with heat and tension, and Alexander stood at the head of his army, calm, his eyes fixed not on the enemy before him, but on the horizon beyond them. When the Persians charged, their chariots thundering across the plain, Alexander waited until the dust nearly swallowed the sun. Then he moved. With perfect precision, his phalanx held the line, while his cavalry tore open the Persian flank. In one moment of pure chaos and genius, Alexander led a wedge straight toward Darius, shattering the center of the empire. The great king fled once more, his empire crumbling behind him. Babylon opened its gates in surrender, and soon after, Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia, fell into Macedonian hands. The palaces gleamed with gold and ivory, a century's wealth glittering in the torchlight. For a moment, Alexander stood in awe of what he had conquered, the weight of centuries beneath his feet. But awe turned to fury when he remembered the Persian burning of Athens, and in a night of drunken triumph and vengeance, Persepolis burned. Flames rose into the sky, a funeral pyre for an empire that had ruled half the world. Yet even then, Alexander was restless. He pursued Darius into the east, through mountains and dust, only to find the king murdered by his own men, his empire now truly dead. But where most would have turned home, Alexander pressed onward. To him, there was always another horizon, another secret to uncover. He began to adopt Persian dress, married Eastern princesses, and demanded that his men kneel before him as a god. Some whispered he was no longer Greek at all, that his conquest was changing him into something unknown. But to Alexander, divinity was not arrogant, was destiny. The boy who had tamed Bucephalus now sought to tame the very world itself, even if it consumed him in the process. With Persia conquered and its kings reduced to dust, Alexander could have returned home as the greatest hero in history, but home no longer called to him. The world was vast, and he had come to believe it had no true boundaries. From the high plateaus of Persia he turned his gaze eastward, toward the lands whispered of in legend, a place where the sun rose and the sky met the earth. He led his army into Bactria and Sogdiana, lands of fierce tribes and frozen passes, where even the stars seemed unfamiliar. His enemies no longer fought as empires, but as ghosts, striking from mountains, vanishing into snow and sand. Yet Alexander pressed on, marrying Roxana, a princess of the region, not as a token of peace, but as a symbol of unity between conqueror and conquered. He began to dream of blending East and West into one empire, one people, one vision. His soldiers followed him through impossible terrain, across deserts where men drank their own sweat to survive, and over mountains where frostbite claimed their hands before their swords did. Still, he drove them forward, driven by a hunger that no victory could satisfy. By the time he reached the borders of India, even his closest generals began to whisper of madness. At the Hydaspes River, he faced King Porus, a ruler who met him not with fear, but with elephants great, towers of flesh and iron that thundered across the battlefield. The clash was unlike anything the Greeks had ever seen, chaos made alive, and yet Alexander prevailed, impressed enough by Porus's courage to make him an ally. But when he spoke of pushing farther east, to the Ganges, to lands beyond maps and myths, his men finally refused. They wept as they begged him to turn back, not from cowardice, but from exhaustion. For the first time, Alexander hesitated. and the realization struck him like an arrow that even a god must bow to the limits of mortal flesh. He turned his army westward, beginning the long, bitter march home. Many would not survive it. As the rain fell over the Indian plain, Alexander looked into the horizon and understood that he had reached the edge not just of the world, but of himself. The retreat from India was not a march, but a slow disintegration. The dream of empire began to unravel under the weight of exhaustion, disease, and death. Alexander chose to lead his men through the Jedrusin, desertan, unforgiving wasteland of salt and fire, believing that the gods demanded a trial before his return. It was a decision that would turn victory into torment. The sand burned beneath their feet, and the wind carried nothing but dust and the scent of death. Water became more precious than gold. Men drank blood from their dying horses, and the sun bleached bones into pale monuments across the dunes. Alexander, refusing comfort, walked beside his men, sharing their thirst and despair. When a small group of soldiers found a helmet full of water and offered it to him, he poured it into the sand without drinking, a silent gesture that burned into their memory like scripture. Still, they died by the hundreds. Some whispered that the gods were punishing him for his pride, for daring to bridge heaven and earth. Others believed the desert was his true enemy, a final test of his will. By the time they emerged from Jedrusia, what had once been an army of conquest was now a procession of ghosts. The survivors stumbled into Carmania, their eyes hollow, their armor rusted, their dreams stripped bare. And yet, when Alexander entered the city, he demanded a festival, a celebration of survival, of triumph over death itself. They drank, danced, and wept beneath torches that flickered like dying stars. The air was thick with madness, and in that chaos, Alexander seemed more a spirit than a man, his face illuminated by firelight, his body moving with divine fury. He had crossed the world and bent it to his will, yet each step forward brought him closer to something no sword could conquer. The empire stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, but within his heart was a growing emptiness, an understanding that no territory could satisfy the hunger that drove him. The desert had not defeated Hemet, had stripped him bare, leaving only the question that no victory could silence. If the world belonged to him, then who did he belong to? When Alexander finally returned to Babylon, the city seemed to breathe in his shadow. The Euphrates shimmered like molten glass under the sun, and the air was heavy with the scent of incense, sweat, and empire. Babylon was not just a city, it was the crossroads of the world, a place where the gods of every nation whispered to one another through smoke and silence. Here, Alexander began to dream again. He spoke of new campaigns, of conquering Arabia, of turning the empire into a single living organism with him as its beating heart. His commanders, worn and weary, watched him with quiet dread. The soldiers who had once followed him into storms now longed for home, their eyes dim with years of war. Yet Alexander was not a man who could rest. He sought to merge East and West, to weave Greeks and Persians into one people. He held vast banquets where Macedonian generals sat beside Persian nobles, where music from a dozen nations filled the halls like waves colliding. He married Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian noble, and commanded his officers to marry Persian women. Some obeyed out of loyalty, others out of fear, but beneath the surface, resentment simmered. The old soldiers whispered that their king was no longer theirs, that he was becoming something else, something too vast, too foreign, and still the city obeyed his will. Babylon bent to his presence like a reed to wind, yet something fragile had begun to crack inside him. Nights grew longer, darker. He wandered the gardens and palaces alone, haunted by visions of his fallen friends, by the endless faces of the dead who had followed him from Greece to India. The wine became stronger, the silences deeper. He spoke often of Hephaestion, his closest companion, who had died not long before. Some said he could still hear his voice in the halls of the palace. Others said he slept beside his armor, refusing to let go. His court filled with omens and eclipse, a raven falling dead at his feet, a strange wind that extinguished the temple lamps. Priests whispered that Babylon was cursed for kings, that no conqueror could rule it long. Alexander laughed at them, but even laughter could not hide the trembling in his hands. It began with a fever, a quiet ache in the bones that no one feared at first. Babylon's air was thick with disease and wine, and even the gods seemed to sleep in the humid stillness of its nights. Alexander, still young and burning with ambition, drank deeply, celebrated often, and planned endlessly. He spoke of new horizons, of oceans yet unseen, of cities that would outlast eternity. But as the days passed, his voice began to fade. The fever grew stronger, and the conqueror who had marched through deserts and storms could no longer stand. His generals gathered around his bed, watching as the fire within him flickered and waned. He had no Aaronian empire, too vast for any one man to rule. The air in the palace grew heavy with tension and fear. Outside, the people prayed. Inside, the soldiers wept in silence. His voice, once sharp as bronze, became a whisper. They asked him to whom he would leave his empire, and he murmured, to the strongest. Some said he smiled as he said it, others swore it was a curse. In those final hours, he asked to be carried to the river, to feel the cool breath of water against his skin. As they lifted him, the army tens of thousands strong filed past in silence. They say every soldier, every man who had followed him across the world, looked upon him one last time. His eyes, fever bright and hollow, seemed to hold the reflection of everything he had built and everything he would lose. He died on the 10th day of his illness, only 32 years old. Babylon was silent that night. The torches burned low, and the city seemed to mourn as one. No birds sang, no wind stirred the palms. The empire, stretched from Egypt to India, began to fracture even before his body cooled. His generalsmen he had raised to glory turned on each other like wolves. The world he had united in conquest was breaking apart, and yet his name remained. A ghost in the ruins, a whisper in every language. The man who had called himself son of Zeus had finally met something even he could not. Conquer time itself. When Alexander's body lay cold in Babylon, his generals, those men who had once marched beneath a single banner, stood around him like vultures circling a carcass of gold. There was no heir old enough to rule, no clear command, only ambition and suspicion woven together like a curse. Perdiccas, his loyal commander, claimed the right to oversee the empire until Roxana's unborn child could inherit. But others, Ptolemy, Antigonus, Seleucus, and Cassander, saw the opportunity that comes only once in history to seize fragments of a fallen god's creation. The empire Alexander had forged with blood and vision splintered overnight, not with a cry but with a whisper of betrayal. Babylon became a court of knives. Oaths were broken before they were spoken. Ptolemy, wary of the chaos, took Alexander's body and carried it to Egypt, stealing not just a corpse but the symbol of divine legitimacy. He entombed him in Alexandria, ensuring the city would forever pulse with the ghost of its founder. Perdiccas was soon murdered, his blood soaking into the dust of Egypt's deserts, and the wars of the Diadochitha successors began. For decades, the earth itself seemed to tremble under the weight of shifting crowns. Armies of Greeks fought Greeks, brother against brother, all in the name of the man who had dreamed of unity. Kingdoms rose and fell like waves in a storm. Antigonus claimed Asia, but was struck down by a coalition of his rivals. Seleucus carved out a vast eastern domain, a reflection of Alexander's empire in miniature, while Ptolemy turned Egypt into a jewel of learning and power. Cassander ruled Macedonia, staining it with the blood of Alexander's mother, wife, and child. By the time the wars quieted, the world had changed beyond recognition. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged were born from ambition and ashmonarchies that carried Greek culture to the edges of the known world, yet ruled through foreign tongues and Eastern gold. The unity Alexander had sought became an echo scattered across continents. In marble cities and sunlit temples, his statues still stood. But his empire lived only in fragmentage, ruled by men who had once knelt before him. And though his empire was gone, his legend had only begun to grow, spreading through centuries like a flame that refused to die. The wars of the successors left behind a world drenched in both brilliance and blood. Out of Alexander's shattered empire rose three great powers, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, and the Antigonids in Macedonia. Each claimed to carry the torch of Alexander's vision, yet each betrayed it in their own way. The Ptolemies built a dynasty of gold and intellect, their capital Alexandria shimmering like a dream at the edge of the Mediterranean. Its lighthouse burned like a star over the sea, and its library vast, sacred. Infinite gathered the wisdom of the world beneath its marble arches. Scholars whispered in Greek and Egyptian alike, translating the languages of gods and men. Yet even here, beneath the perfume of lotus and ink, power ruled with an iron fist. The Ptolemies, descended from Macedonian soldiers, cloaked themselves in pharaonic glory, marrying siblings and calling themselves gods to command obedience. Far to the east, the Seleucids ruled from Babylon to the Indus, their cities bursting with Greek theatres and Persian palaces, a strange fusion of cultures that both enriched and divided their lands. Trade caravans wound through deserts, bringing silk, spices, and stories of Alexander's conquests to markets alive with the scent of incense and iron. Yet their rule was fragile, too vast, too diverse, held together only by ambition. In the north, the Antigonids clung to Macedonia, their homeland scarred by generations of war. The old heart of Greece still beat, but faintly. City-states like Athens and Sparta had become shadows of their former selves, pawns in the games of greater powers. Across the Aegean, art and philosophy still flourished. Yet the glory of freedom had given way to the quiet dignity of survival. Statues grew more lifelike, capturing sorrow and motion as if to mourn the gods who no longer walked among men. The Hellenistic age was a paradoxan era of wonder built upon conquest, of enlightenment born from chaos. Greek thought spread to every corner of the known world, shaping the languages, laws, and dreams of distant peoples. And through it all, one question lingered like a haunting melody in marble halls and desert winds alike. Had Alexander's empire truly died? Or had it merely changed its face, living on through the very cultures it sought to conquer? At the heart of this new world stood Alexandria city, not born from ancient soil, but from the imagination of a conqueror. Built where the Nile kissed the sea, it rose like a vision carved from sun and stone, a city designed to outlast time itself. Its streets ran straight and wide, lined with columns that gleamed like ivory beneath the relentless light. The air was filled with the sound of scholars debating, traders shouting, and ships creaking in the harbor, their sails heavy with goods from 3 continents. Here stood the great library, a sanctuary for knowledge that defied mortality. Within its halls, scrolls from Persia, India, and Greece rested side by side, their ink breathing the wisdom of centuries. Scholars came from every land, mathematicians, poets, philosophers, to study beneath its vaulted ceilings. It was said that every ship entering the port was required to surrender its manuscripts so they could be copied and stored, ensuring that no piece of human thought would be lost to the sea. Beside it, the museum, the temple of the Muses, served as a meeting place for the brilliant and the curious, where astronomy met poetry and geometry shared wine with myth. At night, the lighthouse of Pharos pierced the dark, its flame burning across the water like a beacon for lost souls, guiding them to the heart of civilization. Yet, for all its splendor, Alexandria was also a place of shadows. Power here was delicate, balanced between Greeks, Egyptians, and Jews, each community thriving but wary, each bound by invisible walls. The Ptolemies ruled as divine monarchs, yet beneath the gold and ceremony, their dynasty trembled with intrigue and betrayal. Brothers poisoned brothers, queens murdered rivals, and the whispers of palace servants could decide the fate of kingdoms. Still, the city endured. Its spirit was too vast to be undone by politics. Alexandria became the world's mirror, reflecting both the brilliance and the madness of humanity. Its light drew travelers from every horizon, dreamers chasing immortality through ink and stone. And as the waves crashed against the marble docks, one could almost hear the echo of Alexander's voice carried in the wind, a reminder that empires crumble, but ideas endure, blazing like stars above the ruins. To the east, beyond the reach of the Nile's brilliance, stretched the vast dominion of the Seleucid kings, a realm stitched together by ambition but fraying at every edge. Founded by Seleucus, one of Alexander's fiercest generals, this empire spanned from the mountains of Anatolia to the valleys of the Indus, a mosaic of languages, gods, and forgotten loyalties. Its cities were monuments to both Greek order and Eastern grandeur. Antioch, the jewel of the Seleucid crown, shimmered beside the Orontes River, its streets alive with processions, markets, and marble temples. Here, Greek theatres echoed beside Persian ziggurats, and merchants from India sold spices beneath statues of Apollo. But beneath its splendor lay unease. The Seleucids ruled too many lands, too many hearts. Their armies were vast, yet scattered, their loyalty diluted by distance. Greek settlers clung to their colonies in Bactria and Parthia, surrounded by deserts and restless tribes. The kings themselves, born of war, were haunted by the ghost of Alexander's shadow they could never escape. Each ruler sought to be his reflection, yet all fell short. Some turned to luxury, drowning in silk and wine. Others to paranoia, blinded by fear of revolt. They built cities with names like Seleucia, Apamea, Laodicea, an echo of themselves. A desperate attempt to leave permanence in a world shifting like sand. Over time, their grasp began to weaken. In the Far East, Greek soldiers who had once marched beneath the Macedonian banner carved out their own kingdom, Greco-Bactria, strange fusion of Hellenic ideals and Central Asian soul. To the west, Rome grew stronger, watching silently as the Seleucid kings devoured one another. Even as philosophers and astronomers thrived under their rule, the heart of their empire began to slow, its pulse uneven. Rebellions erupted like sparks in dry grass, and the old Persian gods stirred beneath the temples of Zeus. The Seleucids were heirs to Alexander's dream, but prisoners of his legacy. They ruled an empire that stretched farther than they could hold, a reflection of his ambition now cracked and fading. In their twilight, they became what they had once conquered, divided, uncertain, mortal, yet still in the glow of fading torches. The name of Alexander lingered on their tongues, as if by speaking it, they could summon his impossible fire once more, back in the rugged hills of Macedonia, where Alexander had first learnt the art of war beneath the gaze of his father. The Antigonid dynasty held fast to the homeland of kings, though their territory was smaller than the vast dominions of the Seleucids or Ptolemies. Their roots dug deeper into the soil of Greece itself. The Antigonids were warriors by blood and survivors by necessity. From Antigonus Wunae to his descendants, they fought endlessly to preserve the spark of Macedonian strength against the tides of foreign power. Their capital at Pella was humbler than the marble cities of the East, yet it throbbed with the heartbeat of the old world, the rhythm of phalanxes drilling in the fields, of poets reciting beneath open skies, of farmers who still whispered the names of Philip and Alexander as if they were gods. Greece under the Antigonids was no longer the land of independent city-states, but a realm of fading memories and fractured pride. Athens still sang of freedom, but lived under Macedonian shadow. Sparta, once a name that shook the world, had become a relic, a museum of its former glory. Yet even as the Antigonids ruled with iron and strategy, they carried the burden of nostalgia. They looked south to the Peloponnese and east to the Aegean, watching as the once mighty Greek cities quarreled and schemed, their power long since drowned in the golden flood of empire. The Antigonid kings, particularly Philip V and his son Perseus, tried to restore the might of their ancestors. They forged alliances, reformed armies, and sought to rekindle the fire that had once burned in Alexander's veins. But a new shadow was rising beyond the horizon Rome. The Antigonids fought bravely against it, their phalanxes still proud and disciplined. But Rome's legions fought with a different kind of order, one that devoured kingdoms not through glory but through inevitability. When Perseus faced the Romans at Pydna in 168 BCE, the world shifted. The Macedonian phalanx, the weapon that had conquered Asia, shattered before the disciplined maneuvers of the Roman legions. As the dust settled, Macedonia was broken, and the Antigonid line extinguished. Greece would never again command its own destiny. The cradle of civilization had become a province of empire, its crown handed to a new master across the sea. After the fall of the Antigonids, Greece entered an age of twilight, a place where the echoes of glory drifted through marble ruins and forgotten temples. The cities that had once commanded armies and philosophies now bowed beneath Roman banners, their orators silenced, their soldiers disarmed. Yet even in subjugation, the Greek spirit refused to die. The Romans, conquerors of land and law, found themselves conquered by the mind. They took Greece's art, its gods, its language, its ideast wore them like armor. The empire that had crushed the Macedonian phalanx now recited the verses of Homer and studied the logic of Aristotle. In Athens, the schools of philosophy still stood, though their halls grew quieter. Stoics debated fate beneath cracked columns. Epicureans spoke of pleasure as escape from the chaos of empire, and Platonists dreamed of perfect forms that no army could touch. Theatres still opened their doors, though the tragedies had grown softer, tinged with nostalgia for a greatness that could no longer be reclaimed. The marble statues that once honored heroes now looked upon conquerors with eyes of patient irony, as if to say that even Rome would one day fall. In the countryside, old sanctuaries crumbled into ivy and stone, the voices of the gods fading like smoke. Delphi, once the navel of the world, became a whisper of dust. The Olympic Games continued for a time, but the cheers were hollow, their victors celebrated not by free men but by subjects. Yet through all this decay, a quiet transformation began. Greek became the language of scholarship across the Mediterranean, the tongue of philosophy, medicine, and science. The torch of thought burned on, carried not by kings or warriors but by poets and scholars. In Alexandria, astronomers mapped the heavens. In Rhodes, engineers built machines that defied belief. The old Greece was gone, but its soul had slipped beyond the reach of conquest. When Roman senators quoted Greek texts and emperors adorned their palaces with Athenian marble, it was clear that though Greece had lost the world, it had won eternity. And so, in that paradox, the final flame of Greece burned not in battle, but in brilliance, not in empire, but in memory. And so the story of ancient Greece closes not with the clash of swords, but with a quiet triumph that outlasted every empire that rose upon its ruins. Though the temples crumbled and the marble heroes fell to dust, something eternal survived in the rhythm of its words, the clarity of its thought, the vision of its art. Greece did not vanish, it transformed, flowing like an underground river through centuries, feeding civilizations that would never see its shores. The Romans ruled the world, but they spoke in the language of Greece's ghosts. Centuries later, when the darkness of the Middle Ages closed upon Europe, it was Greek fire that rekindled the human mind, reborn in Byzantium's scholars, carried west by refugees who fled the fall of Constantinople, and reborn again in the Renaissance, when artists and thinkers rediscovered the perfection of proportion, reason, and beauty that Greece had given the world. Every pillar raised in Rome, every law of logic, every poem of longing carried traces of its hand. Even the modern world, with its cities of glass and its restless pursuit of knowledge, still walks the paths Greece first laid beneath the sun of Attica. Its philosophers taught us to question, its historians to remember, its tragedians to feel, and its sculptors to dream of gods in human form. It gave us democracy, though fragile, and the idea that the individual could shape destiny. It gave us the theatre, the academy, the Olympian ideal, the belief that greatness was not divine inheritance, but human pursuit. In every echo of reason, in every whisper of art, Greece still breathes. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it, the chorus of voices rising from the ruins, calling through time. The murmur of Socrates by the Athenian agora, the cry of Leonidas at Thermopylae, the soft rustle of waves against Delos, where the gods were born. These are not memories, they are foundations. The stones of Greece lie broken, yet they hold the architecture of the mind itself. Sit back, close your eyes, and imagine the wind moving across the Parthenon's columns, the sea glittering like silver beneath the same sky that watched over Homer's words. That sky has not changed. It is the same one that waits above you, now ancient, infinite, and quietly watching.